In the next couple of months, we're going to see the launch of the most exciting full-frame mirrorless cameras we've seen for a while. They will change everything about the photography industry. We're going to see real working $1,000 full-frame cameras. We're going to see the first Canon and Nikon true competitors to the incredibly popular Sony A7 Mark III. We're going to see our first real professional grade Nikon Z and Canon R cameras. What will this mean to you? Should you hold off and wait until these cameras come out instead of upgrading? I'll tell you in just a second. First, I want to thank our sponsor, Squarespace. Your social media is holding you back. Your social media is not a good enough web presence. When people go to your Instagram or your Twitter or your Facebook, are they seeing the best that you have to offer? Even if they are, they're seeing it cluttered with ads in a format you have no control over. Squarespace makes incredibly gorgeous websites incredibly easy to set up. Drag and drop your pictures in there. Put in your prices. Put in a store so people can prepay or order prints. Make multiple Squarespace websites, one for your corporate headshots, one for your family photography, one for your landscape photography, to keep your brands separate and pure. I have like 5 Squarespace websites myself. Everybody loves Squarespace. If you want to try it for yourself, go to squarespace.com/Tony. They'll give you a 14-day free trial. Just set it up, no credit card. If you love it, after that trial, use the coupon code Tony and you'll get 10% off. Thanks, Squarespace. What is driving these incredible new cameras? I think a big factor is the underwhelming Canon EOS RP. When Canon first pitched it to us, I didn't even bother to review it because I didn't think it was going to be a big deal. But now I own 8 of them. And in fact, I'm recording this on a Canon EOS RP. This body has driven like $40,000, $50,000 in body and lens purchases for us as we build out our own YouTube studio. But it turns out the RP is also an amazing stills camera and nobody else has anything like it. You can get a kit with the lens and a full frame camera with an EVF, great video quality, a flippy screen for $1,000 at that link. And nobody else can do that. For everybody else, you'd have to downgrade to an APS-C camera, or maybe you'd pick up a Sony A7 Mark II, which is super old and has just like garbage interface and terrible autofocus. It's time for an answer. And I think the Sony answer is going to be the Sony A5. I think they're going to hit a $1,000 price point to start with, MSRP, and then drive the price down from there. Sony has made their brand based on building less expensive, underpriced camera bodies like the Sony A7 III. So I'm really surprised they waited this long to answer to Canon. I think this is going to be really stripped down. I think they're going to take out the EVF, which, believe it or not, a lot of younger users don't use anyway, because what camera did they use when they learned? A smartphone. So they're not used to needing an EVF, and if they can reduce the cost and the weight, I think they will. I think they'll take out the sensor stabilization too. The kit lenses are stabilized anyway, so they won't be missing out on anything, and if they decide to upgrade to better lenses, well, they'll just have to upgrade to one of the more expensive Sony bodies, which is ultimately what Sony really wants. I don't think they'll give it any impressive specs, but I think they'll give it 4K 30 full width, just like their other cameras, and they'll keep the frames per second down to differentiate it. Maybe they'll target 5 frames per second. I think it'll have a flip forward screen, which we first saw from Sony in the ZV-1 because we love it and creators really, really like it. And I think they'll keep it down to just a single card slot, again, to differentiate it from the higher end professional cameras. And thanks to Sony Alpha Rumors for providing the possibility of the existence of this. Some of those specs in italics over here are my own guesses. Now let's talk about Nikon's entry in the low-cost market, the Nikon Z5. You can tell just from the name that it's positioned below the higher-end Nikon Z7 and Nikon Z6. I think the price point is going to be about $1,200. I don't know that, but the rest of the specs seem pretty solid from NikonRumors.com. 24 megapixel sensor, probably the same one that's in the Nikon Z6. 2 SD card slots, which is very different from the Z6 and Z7. People were really critical of them for only having a single card slot, and it is this very expensive XQD card slot. They think it's going to have the same electronic viewfinder as the Z6 and the same autofocus capabilities. Now, those are lacking a little bit when we tested it, but Nikon has released firmware updates and it is better. They're still lagging behind Sony and Canon and Fuji, but they're catching up to the point where it can be pretty usable. Nikon Rumors thinks it's going to have a nice top display, which I find useful for quickly setting up my camera before I bring it to my eye, and it will have sensor stabilization. So they're not positioning it as a entry-level full-frame camera, but a little bit above that. One interesting spec is Nikon Rumors thinks it's going to record 4K video, but with a heavy 1.7 times crop, meaning it will have a weaker processor that can only do a 1-to-1 readout of the center of the frame. This might simply be to differentiate it from the higher-end Z6 camera, which has become popular with serious videographers. They expect it to have 6 frames per second and to be launched in the second half of July. I'm excited to see these lower price points for these full-frame cameras, but I'm also a little bit nervous about the impact this is going to have on the Fuji X mount and the Micro Four Thirds mount as the benefits for price and size disappear and we see the advantages of these full-frame cameras and what they can do. Canon's EOS R6, we haven't really covered it before because it's been living in the shadow of its bigger brother, the 8K EOS R5, but the R6 is the camera that I expect to sell far, far better. Though it's lower end, it is a better fit for most people. CanonRumors.com thinks it's going to come in at about the $2,500 price point, which is actually positioned over the EOS RP and the EOS R. This is going to be one of our first real pro-grade cameras. Interestingly, it has a low-resolution sensor, the 20 megapixel sensor, probably the exact same sensor from their high-end 1DX Mark III. That is a professional sports camera, and professional sports photographers care more about small file sizes, a big buffer, and rapid workflow than they do about tons and tons of detail. 20 megapixels is enough for them, and it will have to be enough for the EOS R6 buyers. It will have Canon's new sensor stabilization system, so you'll be able to put on nice primes and use them off a tripod, something I would really like. The big advantage of this is going to be a 12 frames per second mechanical shutter and a 20 frames per second electronic shutter. Will this be a good sports camera? That really depends on whether or not the autofocus system is up to it. I kind of doubt that it's going to be up to the specs of the 1DX Mark III. I don't think we're going to be seeing sports photographers moving mirrorless just yet. But if it is a progression of the focusing system that I've seen in the EOS R and RP, which has gotten better with firmware updates, then it might be the first camera that we could really use for professional grade wedding and portrait photography. As rumored by Canon Rumors, the video specs are that it will shoot 4K 60 and full HD 1080 at 120 frames per second. That is a step above anything Canon has ever done before, but a step below the EOS R5 that they expect to be priced closer to $4,000. It will have the C-Log for those of you who want more dynamic range in your video, as well as 10-bit color and zebras. These are capabilities that really only videographers care about. It as advertised as having head and animal AF, but not IAF, which is interesting, but at only 20 megapixels, maybe you don't actually need the precision of IAF since you're not capturing a huge amount of detail, like maybe head AF is simply good enough and IAF might have been a waste of processing power. The viewfinder is expected to be a 5 million dot EVF, which is sharper than we've seen in the other Canon cameras. It will have 2 UHS card slots and no top screen. Canon Rumors thinks it's going to be launched on July 9th, 2020, so we should see it really soon. And if you're thinking about buying a new camera, maybe best just wait a couple of weeks until we get perfect clarity on these. My goals for the camera industry, what I want to see to help keep them alive, is for them to continue to drive the prices of full-frame cameras down to the $500 price point. When people say, what camera should I get? I say, how much do you want to spend? And they say $300 to $500, almost universally. I have asked waiters and multimillionaires, and they all say $300 to $500. I really need them to have an entry into their full frame system at that price point. Why not just use Nikon's approach and have less expensive APS-C cameras like the Nikon Z5? And it's because they have to put R&D into developing an entirely separate APS-C lens lineup. Consumers are also very confused about this. I know you're not, but new camera buyers are confused about which Canon or Nikon lenses or which sensor sizes and which are compatible. That simplicity will really help. It also is a more clear upgrade path. People can continue to use their existing lenses with no penalty when they upgrade to more expensive full-frame camera bodies, and that's ultimately the goal of these entry-level cameras. It's not to sell a single camera, but to sell people on an entire infrastructure. Well, hopefully they will spend thousands and thousands of dollars over the next couple of decades. That is what drives the camera industry. I also hope to see the first Canon and Nikon mirrorless cameras that are truly better than their DSLRs. We have a close friend who borrowed Chelsea's Sony A7 III and a Nikon Z6. She's currently a Nikon D750 shooter and a portrait and wedding photographer, and she wanted to upgrade. She wanted things like IAF and an electronic viewfinder and all those benefits of mirrorless, but after she tested them both, she said, I'm gonna keep my D750 and maybe I'll buy a D850. But testing those cameras, she said mirrorless just wasn't for her. The autofocus just wasn't fast enough, it just wasn't reliable enough, and it just didn't feel as good as those big Nikon SLRs. Nikon and Canon are both missing their huge audience of serious and professional photographers who love their benefits of the DSLR and aren't willing to take any setbacks when they go mirrorless. This video was made possible by Squarespace. Just like my many different websites are made possible by Squarespace, they make it extremely easy to have an amazing web presence, whether it's for your photography portfolio or your law office or your restaurant. You need an amazing web presence and you don't want to spend a bunch of time doing it or learn things like CSS or HTML. With Squarespace, all of that is possible, and if you need help, they have an amazing 24/7 support crew who are there to give you a hand. Give it a try at squarespace.com/Tony. If you love it, the coupon code Tony will get you 10% off. In the comments down below, I'd like to hear what you'd like to see from the next Canon, Nikon, and Sony camera. If one of the cameras I just suggested comes out as I suggested it, would you buy it, or are you still willing to wait a little bit longer? If you're a DSLR shooter, what do you need to see before making that move to mirrorless? I'm Tony Northrup. Don't forget to subscribe. Bye.